Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. The greatest threat to businesses today isn't the outsider trying to get in. It's the people you trust, the ones who already have the keys, your employees, contractors, and privileged users. 60% of online attacks are carried out by insiders. To stop these insider threats, you need to see what users are doing before an incident occurs. Observe It enables security teams to detect risky user activity, investigate incidents in minutes, and effectively respond. Get your free trial at observeit.com/securityweekly. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Mark your calendars for the Security Weekly holiday extravaganza on December 19th. Security Weekly will be streaming 5 one-hour panel discussions with some of the most knowledgeable professionals in the industry. To round out the evening, Ed Skodas will be joining us in traditional fashion to announce the Holiday Hack Challenge. That's the Counter Hack Holiday Hack Challenge. You can view the live stream on that day by going to securityweekly.com/live. We'll have a blue team roundtable, red team roundtable, AppSec roundtable, security history, and security versus compliance. Yes. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I've already started prepping some of the topics, and I'm just like imagining the discussions, and it is not to be missed for sure. Our guest for this segment is Ken Belva, a result-oriented information security professional with 20 years of experience in the areas of governance, policies, application, database, network security, vulnerability research as well, which we were talking about just before this segment started. He is the CEO and founder of Opcode 41. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to have you here and talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. We were comparing notes before the segment, and certainly the insecurity of IoT devices is always an interesting topic, and one that it's kind of sad that the state of the security of these devices we haven't really moved the needle, which is kind of disappointing. And even in just one aspect that we'll talk about today, Ken, in credentials, right? We got default credentials, weak credentials, backdoor credentials, which I can almost put in a different category, right? And also no credentials at all to access some of these devices. So there's really like 4 different categories just in the authentication to these devices.
Absolutely. And you're 100% right in the fact that things really haven't changed. I mean, if you go back, let's say, 15, 20 years, we had the same thing with embedded printers that we have now with IoT devices, some without credentials at all. But these days, as IoT devices become more widespread on the network, these embedded devices, they have these default embedded and weak credentials, and it's very difficult to manage them. And so oftentimes they looked or they are basically unmanaged, unchecked, and they sit out there, and there are really no good ways to test for them, which is what we had found when we were doing some pen testing to major clients.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, we know this problem existed in embedded printers and in other embedded devices over the years. So I guess one of my fundamental questions is, didn't we learn anything from going through this the last 10 to 15 years, or do the manufacturers just don't care?
I think that, the manufacturers, of course, they end up doing what's easiest for them, right? But from the defensive side, the question is, right, like, how do you detect these things when they're out there? And there really haven't been very good ways of doing this, simply because if you're going to run through and do brute force testing, it takes way too long to do. You end up locking out accounts. And so, especially on limited engagements like pen tests, there isn't the time to do it. And also, you don't really want to upset the client if you end up locking out a ton of stuff. So we had to figure out new ways of checking for this problem across devices in a rapid fashion. And the answer is to get some intelligence in there where there really wasn't before, because the current scanners really don't check for this. And again, as you're saying, it's been around forever, and there really hasn't been too many improvements over time over this.
Yeah, I think largely it's left to the tester for them to define what's interesting, right? If they've got landscape or architecture, right, you find some embedded systems without trying to log into them, right? It's just a discovery thing. I've been on pen tests personally where the remote management, so like the embedded device that's inside of all of your servers that gives you the ability to remotely power on and power off and log into the console, that I found that on the network. And I was like, well, it's this particular, I think it was a Dell when they used to call it DRAC. And there was either no authentication or the default credentials to log in were there. That gave me console access to the server, which lo and behold, someone had logged into the console as root. And so I was sitting at a root prompt on the server. And that stuff happens all the time today, but it's limited in scope. I was like, oh, I see that Dell remote access management thing. I know that there's probably weak authentication, right? And that's the only part of that got me root. So like I was good from there. But what about the thousands of potential other devices on that network, right?
Right, of course. And the issue, of course, is that when you can gain access to these devices, you end up using those as pivot points to get into other places and use that as a launch point. And to your point, right, a lot of these default credentials end up being a root admin. I mean, the only thing worse is some kind of RCE with ring 0 where you're running the code as the operating system. So these things, they're low level hanging fruit, but at the same time, they're basically just as deadly as almost any other kind of vulnerability that's out there when you think about it from that perspective.
And so I've had these discussions with vulnerability management companies, including ones I've worked for, and it is a hard problem to solve. And Ken, you alluded to this earlier. You run the risk of locking out accounts, knocking over the device, increasing your scan times. Have you had this discussion and enterprises are still struggling with this because of those struggles, basically?
Absolutely. And that's why one of the reasons why I feel that there's been no real improvement on these kinds of detections. And so what we try to do is instead build some intelligence into it. So we will know when we find a certain device, right? And we can map that and say, look, there's only specific credentials that go to this particular device. And so those are the only ones we want to test. And so it cuts down the time tremendously to find these things. And it also limits the account lockout because, ideally we want to do one attempt and that's it. And so that's right. How we've kind of addressed this kind of classic problem that's just existed forever.
Because, Yeah, because I think the way the vulnerability management vendors still do it is you basically create this password list, right? You create this username password list, you pass it to the scanner, and it's not specific to the device. It's just like this master file. And so when that master file keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Now you run into all these issues of brute force and account lockouts and all these other things that really slow the thing down. What I think I just heard you say, Ken, is you decided to put a little smarts to this and say, look, if I see this type of a device, these are the potential usernames and passwords that could apply to that device. And so by doing a proper fingerprint of the IoT device, you're limiting the types of accounts and default credentials you're testing for based on what comes back in your scan. Is that what I just heard you say?
That is 100% correct. And that's how we get the speed improvements and we reduce account lockout down to its bare minimum. Because the goal is basically know what you're testing. And so it's basically as if you were looking it up in your PDF file for the device and then trying those particular credentials. So yeah, and this particular problem came up and it became so acute because we were doing a PCI test. and the endpoint at a major client, a major retailer, where you slide your credit card through to pay, we were finding Telnet on those devices, and we just basically went out to the internet and we looked up the credentials for that particular device, and the next thing you know, we logged into basically every single endpoint for that. And so then we started looking at this problem further along. We realized what the scope of it was.
Interesting. And I mean, from a scope perspective, I mean, you have to understand what it takes to kind of do this, right? Now I got to understand the fingerprint of thousands of these IoT devices. Then I got to go do the research to identify what are the potential default passwords for those thousands of devices. So this probably, from the research side, this kind of multiplies out as more and more of these devices are brought into the networks for scanning, because I got to fingerprint it and know that I got a proper fingerprint to classify. Then I got to go research all the credentials and then put that into the code and let it go.
Yeah, there was actually a lot more man hours that were put into this than people might realize in order to make sure that it was streamlined as much as possible and that it ran smooth, fast, and that the protocol works correctly. Because on certain protocols like Telnet, believe it or not, you have a lot of different Telnet login prompts. So you actually need an interpreter if you're going to speak Telnet, as opposed to something like, say, like FTP, which is much more standardized, or SSH, which is much more standardized. So for HTTP, right, websites have a lot of different ways to authenticate to them. In other words, developers have all different kinds of ways that they code the authentication piece. And also for Telnet, there are actually ways to authenticate which we didn't envision before we started writing the actual client for that. It's pretty amazing, actually, the variation. So there's, as you were saying, a lot of man hours have gone into this.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those, even just simple variations of Telnet. Some of them are very basic. If your script is expecting like a username and a password prompt, sometimes when you Telnet to it, it just dumps you on a prompt without prompting you. There's no credentials on it at all, and Telnet is just a facility to get into the device.
Right. So the weirdest thing that we've seen is this, right? So you have your standard username, password. You have the case that you mentioned where you just automatically arrive at a prompt. And then the other standard one is actually where you arrive and it's just a password, right?
Yes.
But the strangest case that we saw was actually you went in and you received a username prompt, right? And until you got the username correct, you did not receive the password prompt.
Right.
It was really bizarre. So it's like, what's your username? Admin. Nope. What's your username? Admin2. Nope. And then finally, if you said, oh, what's your username? Admin3. Okay, well, here's the password prompt. Where normally it gives, like the user and password and then says, whether you authenticate or not. This one, you needed to get the administrator correct, so the username correct before you could proceed to the password prompt, which is a very terrible implementation for authentication, but it's out there. And so, you need to code for it.
They probably called that two-factor authentication when they were designing it, right?
I don't know what they called it, but we found it out there and we were like, all right, we got code for this. But it was really a bizarre case.
And it's interesting. This is really just Telnet. So many more protocols exist. And one of the things that I found interesting recently is a lot of these devices have different ports that they listen on, and it's some type of web API. And like you said, Kat, it's now you're talking about all kinds of different authentication, all kinds of different calls. Some of them require authentication, some don't. And I've seen some scripts out there that are targeting IoT devices over the API. Have you seen some of this as well?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, one of the really interesting parts is, some of these devices have full stacks, right? So they have a lot of different protocols that are running on them. And one of the things that we found in particular is, HTTP/HTTPS is a very difficult protocol to script for authentication.
Yep.
Because there are a lot of different ways in which a developer can actually write the page to authenticate and to post back. And also you have other things in HTTP, which is like one-time tokens and stuff like that. So to be able to code for all those to do the authentication for those protocols on different devices was challenging, which we accepted, but it's pretty strong.
Yeah, because you need WebKit or something, right? Because you have to be able to render aspects of the DOM to be able to figure out, am I looking for username or password or whatever, right? Because it could be a series of different things, but without the DOM, it would be hard to understand that to try to test against it, right?
Right. There are a couple of different ways to do it, but in the case where there's mainly JavaScript, right, that's what you would need, something like that, which actually does a rendering to then go and do. So you're right on that.
The nice part about the API, though, if you take away anything that provides a page to a user, right, the API is just using HTTP and HTTPS as a transport protocol. Then there's multiple ways you have to authenticate. Some of the calls you may need to authenticate, some don't. So it's actually looking at Google Home devices, which I still think are they calling it Nest Home, whatever. Like a year or so ago, those devices were open. If you knew the port that they were listening on and you studied the API that people had reverse engineered, at one time you could actually send it post requests to make changes on the device. So you could reset the device, you could inject things, you could retrieve passwords from it or Wi-Fi networks from it. Now they've locked some of that down, so only a small subset of those calls still work. I imagine if you take this to all of the IoT devices out there, that you'd find some really interesting things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, our focus is less on those kinds of API calls, which, as you said, can have pretty detrimental effects. And our focus is on basically doing a number of standard protocols that you basically find on any IPv4 network. The reason for that is that as much as we like IoT as a moniker, the reality is that we need a piece of software that works with all devices. So as long as it's running a standard protocol that we can talk to the device. So, but it's a serious problem. And basically, if your scanner doesn't have a plugin for it, then you're basically not doing it.
Ken,
checking it.
What advice do you have for your customers operationally, right? You've given them the tool or the findings to say you've got all these IoT devices out there. What do we need to change potentially in our operations to make sure that these things are secure?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would do is I would start at a security architecture level. I mean, make sure that these devices, which chances are they may not be able to be secured all that much, are properly segmented on the network. I mean, I think that's pretty much the core part of it. But if they need to be amongst other devices, places where more people can access it than probably what you really would want in your architecture, then you start to do these kinds of tests. And especially the more flat your network is, then these things become critical, because all of a sudden they become pivot points. They're very low entry, and anyone who has a laptop that has network connectivity can end up basically in these devices.
Yeah, and I think segmentation in this case is important because sometimes you can't change this credential on a particular device. You can't change the default password, or if it doesn't have authentication, you can't add it unless you. My solution to that was I put a Raspberry Pi in front of it, and I connect the Raspberry Pi to the device, and then the Raspberry Pi gets the other Ethernet to the network, and it acts as a proxy in front of it, so you can SSH in the Pi to gain access to the command prompt.
Right. I mean, that's kind of brilliant for home networking stuff, but I don't think enterprise security can put Raspberry Pis in front of all their devices.
Right. If I've got hundreds or thousands, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, the solution of this stuff is on an architecture level, especially because it's difficult to update devices. Apart from the password credentialing issues, is that they're difficult to update if they can be updated, and if they have vulnerabilities. And it's basically, you have to think of these things as by default vulnerable, is how I look at them. So segmentation is by far the best way to do it. Yep.
And so what do we do with manufacturers? There's been a lot of efforts to get manufacturers to be producing more secure devices, but of course, largely we haven't seen that.
Well, this is something which is kind of a little bit of a contention that I have. But I tend to think that this is one of the core types of security issues that will just never go away. I mean, we've seen it over time since the beginning, where you develop products and you put security on kind of at the end. It's kind of an afterthought. I think we've been getting better at that over time, where you put it more into the SDLC process. But in the end, if you're a manufacturer, you have other security is an important priority, but it's not the highest priority. the highest priority is getting out to market and getting customers, because without the revenue, you really don't have a company. So I think it's going to be one of these tensions that will always exist in cybersecurity, where security fits into this kind of development process. And unfortunately, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I think the answer is that it will always remain towards the back end of these kinds of processes, simply because that's how businesses are structured.
Mm.
Yeah, the other conversation we had on Monday on a similar track was, if you think about these devices, right, they're chip-based, so some manufacturers going out and having a chip developed with requirements in it and maybe some visibility into security, but maybe not to the extent that needs to be addressed, right? And they go out and they run a bunch of chips, and once that chip is run, there's a set of capabilities in it that won't change until they do another chip run. And in the conversation we were having was, kind of that hardware to software understanding of what is being done in these chips and in these firmware devices, what can be done via software. But part of the challenge with some of these devices is you don't have that full software stack necessarily that you do when you're developing your own custom application. So it limits what you can do in a DevOps process because there's just physical limitations in the chipset. So, it just creates some interesting challenges.
For sure. I mean, we saw vulnerabilities that come up in the Intel chipset over the last couple of years, right? So, that is the same thing, maybe perhaps slightly different vulnerabilities, but in the IoT space as well. I mean, if you have something that's embedded in a device, you won't be able to change that. This is particularly true in IP cameras that come out of other countries, where there are kind of like these embedded vulnerabilities, and they're kind of rooted in the device itself. And it will always be a challenge, for sure. But it's a fantastically complex set of problems in the supply chain and how it works, and how these devices, once they do reach the consumer or the business at the endpoint, how they get implemented, and how businesses need to address basically inherent risk in these kinds of devices. It will be, I think, a challenge for quite a long time. And it has implications for, global implications as well, of who is doing these manufacturers and where they're going in, how they're getting in. I think there was just a case recently, right, where you had a supplier on Long Island supplying hardware essentially into the DoD, right? And they were found, the devices were supposed to be manufactured in the United States, but in fact, what they were doing is they had devices from China that they were just really literally relabeling, saying made in the USA, and then selling them off to the Department of Defense. So again, I think we're going to see these kinds of challenges a long time into the future. And if the vulnerabilities are in the physical implementations, in the chipsets, in the boards, things like that, it's an incredibly difficult problem, because you also have to make sure you have the right researchers to go and detect if these things exist. So it's just a challenge all around.
Yeah, and a lot of folks will, lean on government regulation, but when we get into especially devices that are manufactured in China, how do you impose regulations in other countries, right? That might work here in the U.S., but a lot of these devices are made somewhere else.
Exactly. And the case of this company on Long Island was really fascinating in that sense, because you had a trusted supplier who basically decided that they were going to work with a foreign entity and import those devices and put them into the field. And so, if you don't have an independent set of tests, how are you going to detect if there are vulnerabilities in those devices, especially if you think they're coming from one part, but they're coming from a different part, because the vendor has essentially been compromised. And again, the vulnerabilities that will probably occur in those stacks could occur all the way down into the chipsets, as we were discussing earlier. So it's a pretty nefarious problem.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why you see manufacturers like D-Link basically saying, yeah, we know about these vulnerabilities, but we're not going to fix them, right? They can only go back so far in their code.
Yep.
to fix them. And once they're out there, they're, like Matt was saying, they're a physical device. It's not like an app that gets deployed into the cloud that you can constantly update. Once that small little device is deployed, that's it. If the manufacturer says, yeah, we're not providing updates, then it becomes a legal battle or just something you have to deal with.
Yeah, and it becomes a replacement issue at that point because the physical hardware is the physical hardware at that point, and the only way to get around it is to upgrade and go buy a new device.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I think architecture is the way to solve, or at least address, I should say address, not solve, address some of these issues, is specifically for those kinds of reasons.
Microsoft has produced architecture that allows manufacturers to produce a device that is secure, updatable. I mean, we've done some interviews with folks from Microsoft, and they've continued these projects. It was called Azure Sphere, but there's a couple of other things that tie into that whole project that basically allow you to utilize a platform that solves a lot of these authentication issues, as an example, right? How you manage the devices, how you update the devices, how you ensure that updates are coming from a trusted source. But it's going to take time for companies to adopt that. And then what's the barrier to entry to use that platform, right? A small startup that's importing hardware from China and producing in the market may not be able to afford even the developers to implement that platform.
For sure. I mean, the lack of standards, right, is another aspect of this as well. Basically, it's the Wild West of embedded devices right now. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens in the future. But we've looked at basically a small chunk of these particular problems, and we've focused on default and weak credentials as authentication issues that are pretty much in every standard, right? Every framework. Those are things that should be changed or updated or addressed. And we found that they just haven't been. And companies rely on their scanners. Scanners are great. I'm pro scanner, but if it's not in the scanner and you're relying only on that, then you have a blind spot. And we feel that this is a significant blind spot, and we've seen it in the field when we've gone out and done tests.
And Ken, you've open sourced your script, and there's a link to that in the show notes, so folks can go check it out.
Yeah, what we did is early on we decided to do a proof of concept, and this is about the time when the IoT worms were coming out, so like the Mirai worm and the Hajime worm, and so we wanted people to go out and test for this, and so we created a separate, basically quick script that's not any way related to the professional versions of the code that we've created, but it goes out and you could download it. It's on GitHub, and go out and test for all kinds of device issues with that, for credentials. We actually found, with that script, we found a backdoor in a switch, a core switch once with that.
Nice.
It was it was pretty fascinating. What happened in that case, because we decided to do some research to figure out what exactly happened. And it looks like the vendor had done some acquisitions. And so there was an earlier acquisition of these kinds of switches. And they had, of course, default credentials on the earlier versions. But what happened is the documentation, I guess, was never updated. So when we were pouring through the documentation looking for this credential set, it was not in there. But it was still in the devices that are being shipped out.
Interesting. Interesting. Awesome. Well, Ken, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And look, we hope we add some value to the community with bringing this kind of issue to light. And we hope people go out and check their devices. And really appreciate being here. And thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Ken. With that, we'll take a short break and transition to our pre-recorded interview with Brendan O'Connor. Stay tuned.